Hello, dear viewer. A new story in the military theme, which at first will seem to you quite confusing, but in time everything will come around and you will be filled with emotions, which filled my head by the end. I remind you to like and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget about it, because these actions let YouTube know that my content is really good. Looking forward to getting to the story. Military Affairs, Chapter 1. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the well-furnished parlor, bringing welcome warmth to the slightly chilly Illinois day. Elizabeth studied the dark-haired and dark-eyed woman sitting across from her. Young, very young, perhaps not too far out of her teens, willow-colored. Her dress was clean, but simple and a bit shabby, a stark contrast to Elizabeth's beautiful morning attire. Elizabeth set her tea aside and picked up a letter of introduction from the table beside her. "So, Mary, Genevieve's letter says I can help you, but it doesn't explain exactly what you're looking for." Her deep Mississippi accent had been perfected by years of study at expensive high schools, but she had never completely lost it. The younger woman lowered her gaze to her hands for a moment, then looked at Mary again, and replied in a quiet voice that had a deep Virginia drawl to it. No sophistication, though she clearly had trouble speaking properly. "She said you could understand my problem. She said you have something like it." "Can" sounded like "mot," and "like" sounded like "lock." She took a deep breath, almost shuddering. "I find my situation terrible." Elizabeth waited patiently. The girl had to pull herself together, and in any case Elizabeth had nothing else to do until the evening. Finally, with obvious difficulty, Mary continued. "I need to find a former Yankee soldier. I'm not sure he's alive. His name is Captain Jeremiah Lodge of the 3rd Illinois Cavalry. They were stationed in Virginia, near Wheeling." "The new state of West Virginia," Elizabeth pondered. "For what purpose are you doing this?" Mary looked shocked. She clearly didn't feel like answering the question, but it was simply unseemly to ignore a direct question from a woman in Elizabeth's position. "I don't know exactly, ma'am. I haven't figured it out yet." But nerves made her accent deeper, so it came out a little differently. Don't rightly know, ma'am. I haven't figured it out yet." Tears came to her eyes, and for a moment she thought she was going to break. Mary fought herself, clenched her jaw tightly, and continued more measuredly and clearly. "I can't stop thinking about him. I've tried." Elizabeth wondered if a child was involved. Scandalous, sure, but hardly unheard of, especially for a young girl from the Highlands during a time of war. "If I may ask, are there any commitments?" Mary looked frankly puzzled, then blinked, realizing the meaning of Elizabeth's words. "God, no. But if he's alive and I find him, he may not want to see me." Elizabeth cast a critical eye over her. She was certainly beautiful enough in her grim, somber manner. "I would prefer to think that any man would gladly accept your visit." "Well, maybe he didn't. You see, I shot him. Twice." Even Elizabeth's carefully considered and poised demeanor had cracked. "You shot him twice?" "3 times. I forgot about the last time. That hardly counts. It was a cobbler's gun, just a baby Patterson. And I really didn't mean to kill him that time." 3 times? "He was an abolitionist soldier, ma'am." She said it with finality, as if it explained everything. "And you still want to find him?" "I think I should. Like I said, I can't stop thinking about him. And we can get married. So there you go." Elizabeth refilled Mary's tea, then her own, and leaned back in her chair, smiling. After all, it was no wonder Genevieve had sent her on her way. It would be a delightful diversion. It promised to be very amusing. "I guess you'll have to tell me the whole story." August 3. 1861, Cripple Creek Road near Sutton, Virginia. Mary smoothed out her blue Sunday dress. It was the best dress she had ever owned, and though she hated the color, she thought the dressiness and color made her a less tempting target at the hands of the hated Yankee cavalry that patrolled the roads. She had heard horror stories of girls kidnapped and mistreated by these blue-coated devils, none that she knew of, fortunately. Her little pony cart had been searched twice by Union soldiers, but they'd stopped their searches after looking in the bags of clothes she'd brought with her to visit her cousins. It took all her self-control to keep quiet during the searches. She had made this journey 3 times already in the last 2 weeks. 2 more miles and she would be home. Damn the Blue Jackets and their invasion of her state. She was glad the war had started. It was finally time to teach the Yankees a lesson. It seemed to her that the victory of the brave Southerners at Manassas would make the cowards tuck their tails and run for the hills. Perhaps they were too stupid to realize their position. In the end, it didn't matter. A true Southerner was worth 10 Yankee dogs any day, and she helped in any way she could. Lilty Jeremiah Lodge saw a simple 2-wheeled farm cart on the road. A slender, dark-haired girl in a blue dress was easily leading the pony down the dirt road. This was nothing unusual. Many of the local boys had gone south to join the fledgling rebel armies in Richmond, leaving the women and children to run the errands they usually did. Jeremiah planned to simply lead his patrol of 10 men past. As he neared her, he touched the tip of his hat. She nodded stiffly in response, about as much as he could expect from one of the local girls in this part of the state. He would have left that way if it hadn't been for the sound caused by the morning breeze. It was a simple sound, the sound of moving paper. Of course, it wasn't the sound of cotton or crinoline, but the sound of paper freeze. He turned in his saddle and snatched the reins from the girl's hands. She stared at him for a fraction of a second, then tried to hide her hatred beneath icy contempt. But the icy calm lasted only until she spoke. "What do you want, Lincoln puppy?" Jeremiah smiled, as disarmingly as possible. "Lieutenant Jeremiah Lodge, assigned to the Provost Station in Sutton, at your service, ma'am. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to accompany us to headquarters." Her eyes narrowed, and she stared at him. "I'll be damned if I'm going anywhere with that nasty abolitionist in the blue jacket." She dropped the reins and jumped off the cart. Jeremiah was caught off guard by her sudden dash into the woods adjacent to the road, but he still managed to catch her left arm, and for that, he was immediately dragged from the saddle. She switched her efforts from fleeing to attacking, and he began trying, and mostly unsuccessfully, to control the spitting, hissing, and clawing demoness. Just when he was sure she was going to claw his eyes out, she was lifted into the air and held between Sergeant McKay and Trooper Henry, who were laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Jeremiah lifted his hat and brushed the dust off it, trying to extract some dignity from the situation. The other soldier handed him one of several sheafs of paper that had fallen out of the girl's dress during her furious attack. It turned out to be a railroad supply schedule. "I suppose it was accidentally pinned to your dress?" Jeremiah expected denial, maybe tearful remorse. The girl just exploded with hatred. "This is no accident, you damned Yankee. I will not tolerate any favors from a low-born, gutter-crawling mercenary from the Black Republic." Jeremiah stepped back. "So you admit to being a spy?" "I confess my allegiance to my state." She lunged at him, but the strong grip of the policeman saved him from being bitten. At this point, she launched into an obscene diatribe against the Yankees, the North, the Union Army, and Jeremiah himself, detailing the anatomical flaws of Yankees in general, and Jeremiah's lineage in particular. Her accent was so thick, he could barely understand half of what she was saying, and for that he was truly grateful. What he could make out was enough to make even a hardened sailor cringe. Even Sergeant McKay looked impressed, and he was a master of vulgarity at times. Despite being outnumbered, the young woman, who refused to even give her name, had to be bound hand and foot and then placed in her own cart pulled by one of the soldiers. Half an hour after the trip to headquarters, Lieutenant Lodge begged to be relieved from the service to escape its boundless vulgarity. Lodge ordered the young lady's mouth forcibly gagged. Upon arrival in Sutton, the young woman, who refused to walk on her own, was carried to a makeshift headquarters and jail, a former hotel that had been loaned by the provost. After Jeremiah's explanation and a brief, blissfully, very brief, attempt to speak to the captive, Captain Dar sat at his desk and watched with ill-concealed humor. The sergeant and 3 muscular soldiers placed the woman in the former storeroom, which now had a sturdy oak door with a small barred window leading into an inner office. "Lieutenant, I can still hear the paper. Has it been searched properly?" Lieutenant Lodge turned bright red, starting at the tips of his ears. "Sir, I can't—" His voice broke off. Well, Lieutenant, at least we can say with some certainty that she doesn't have a weapon. Otherwise, she's probably made a mess of things here by now. I can't understand almost anything she says, even when she's not gagged, but she doesn't seem to like you too much. I think you're right, sir. Although, in my defense, she doesn't seem to like anyone in particular. Well, she'll have to be searched. Sergeant McKay stepped forward. Sir, if I may, I think I have a solution. 15 minutes later, he returned with his wife, a large, powerful woman, Irish to the core. With them was also one of the wives of the Troika, a tall German woman. Captain Dar led the troopers out, but stopped Jeremiah when he tried to follow. Oh no, the officer must be present during the search or the court-martial will find the evidence inadmissible. Before Jeremiah could object, he continued, making no attempt to hide a smirk. And I'm afraid I've been summoned to a meeting with the colonel in Wheeling, so I should be on my way. Mary listened to the conversations outside her cell, but was completely unprepared for the size of the two women who entered. She felt her visions of fighting for freedom and rushing toward it fade away. The huge red-haired woman took the initiative and removed Mary's gag. "What's your name, dearie?" When Mary didn't say anything, she tilted her head slightly to the side. "Look, dearie, we can do whatever you want, but it will end the same way. There's nothing wrong with telling us your name. We'll know soon enough anyway. So come on, spill it." "Mary." The Irish woman carefully untied Mary's legs and began to untie her hands, speaking calmly and judiciously as she did so. "Well, isn't that news? My name is Mary too. Irish Mary, that's what they call me." She chuckled for a moment. "That doesn't make sense to me. If you call Mary on the street, almost every Irish woman will respond." She shook her head amusedly. "My friend is Bruna. Let's keep it simple. Take off some of your things and we'll let a young gentleman inspect your dress to get more of your deportment." The young lieutenant who had arrested her was facing away from the makeshift cell, but his ears turned even more bright red as Mary watched. When the large woman started, Mary panicked, knowing exactly what they would find. She tugged, breaking free of their grip, through the cell door and to the side. "Stop her! She's running!" The Irish woman's voice boomed through the building. A young cavalry officer jumped to block the only door and found himself bound to a demon from hell. Jeremiah was simply shocked. He was desperately searching for a way to hold her without touching anything inappropriate. Unfortunately, there was nothing appropriate about this slender girl, and while she seemed to have an excess of hands, they, like the girl herself, were far from polite. She was practically nose to nose with him when he met her dark eyes. They both froze for a second before her eyes narrowed and she clawed at his face. But before she could do him any harm, she flew upwards and away from him. For the second time in a few hours, she was dragged away from him to the sound of laughter, held between the Irish woman and her German counterpart, both of whom were laughing uncontrollably. She squirmed slightly against him and stopped struggling. Jeremiah stood up and averted his eyes, took off his jacket, and held it out to the German, though his words were clearly meant for his attacker. "Please be careful with the Bible in your left front pocket. It's a family heirloom." Sergeant McKay's wife spoke up, still chuckling as she wrapped the cowardly girl up. "I should have seen that coming. What were you going to do, dearie? There are almost 500 people outside the door." She looked at her captive almost affectionately. "Tell me next time, dearie, and we can save ourselves the trouble." Mary was taken to the back of the cell and watched closely while a cavalry officer pulled letters and papers from her dress. After her dress was returned to her, the girl simply refused to acknowledge him for anything, which made him feel completely relieved. He made sure the cell door was locked and fled as fast as he could. 2 weeks later, Mary appeared for the third time before Captain Dar, who was scrutinizing a pile of papers. He shook his head slowly. "War is no business for women, young lady. In some places you'd be hanged for espionage. The evidence is certainly ample, and despite Lieutenant Lodge's testimony about your complete inability to think things through, it is espionage." She squared her shoulders and stared at him. "Then hang me. Let the whole world see what you damned bluejackets are really about." "Very dramatic. I don't think you realize the gravity of your situation, young lady. I am inclined to let you go, if only you will promise not to engage in such activities again. He waited impatiently. I promise nothing of the sort. As long as not one of you vile ones desecrates the sacred ground of my state, I will do everything in my power to stop you. Captain Dar rubbed the bridge of his nose in obvious irritation. Desecrate? He sighed. I don't recall giving any order to desecrate anything. It seems I have no choice but to transport you to Wheeling. Maybe they can decide where to send you there. Maybe we can get into a nunnery, or perhaps they have women of a similar disposition they could take you to. Mary described in great detail what the captain, the unfortunate lieutenant, and all the disgusting Yankee pigs would do to themselves. Captain Dar looked at his secretary, who had been taking notes but was now just looking at Mary, frozen in shock. Please don't write down her answer, Elliot. The paper might just burst into flames. She will be escorted to Pro-Marshal Wheeling's office and placed there in custody until the commander of the mining department can locate her. 2 days later, Mary was taken out and put in a wagon for shipment. Her heart ached as the escort pulled up beside them. 16 cavalrymen and 1 Lieutenant Lodge. She couldn't meet his gaze and realized he didn't want to meet her eyes either. Stopping beside her, he looked through her to the dispatch driver, then nodded sharply, giving the order to pull away. As they set off, Mary decided that it would be a very long trip to the railroad terminal in Weston. 3 days. Over the next few days, they came to the conclusion that they could coexist by simply not talking any more than necessary. Despite his disgust at her behavior, beliefs, and general tactlessness, Jeremiah Lodge had developed a respect for her dedication to her beliefs, even if she didn't seem to understand exactly what the whole conflict was about. She was willing to die for her cause, even if she wasn't sure what it was. And while Mary found them not at all redeemable, as they were egregious mercenaries for the Black Republican cause, whatever it was, they treated her far more politely than she expected, even if it was the rather strained politeness of a man trapped with a viper. The locals looked at the patrol without rancor as it escorted her to the station, but it wasn't until they were almost to Weston that no one confronted them. A dignified woman, dressed quite decently as opposed to her usual homespun clothes, came up to him and stood in front of Jeremiah's horse. 16 soldiers seems like a lot to guard one helpless woman. She is hardly helpless, but an escort is needed for the dispatches. We've had too many messengers and wagons with dispatches go missing lately, mistress. The woman made a strange hoarse sound, clearly indicating a complete lack of faith. I would like to speak with your captive. I must make sure she is not subjected to humiliation at your hands. Jeremiah considered telling her that she could take her concerns to Washington, but the woman's demeanor suggested that she would do so if pressed. She might even prefer to do so, given her apparent self-sufficiency. He touched the tip of his hat. You have my permission to speak to her, of course, but you should know that she very rarely manages to make polite conversation with anyone. She swept past him, barely dignifying him with a glance. I'm Clarissa Albright from the Women and Children's Aid Committee in Weston. I have been chosen to learn about your treatment. Mary had little doubt that this woman had chosen herself to make inquiries. Thank you, ma'am. It became clear very quickly that Mrs. Albright was hoping for a horror story of lavish mistreatment from which she could save Mary. She tried to hide her disappointment at Mary's honest admission that she was being treated respectfully and politely. Jeremiah watched with the corner of his eye as Mary recounted her martyrdom somewhat more candidly than he had expected. True, she had left out the fiasco of finding her dress. After Mrs. Albright retired to her cove of supporters to no doubt give an appropriately embroidered account of the conversation, they finally reached the railroad station. After escorting her to the federal troops stationed there, Jeremiah dipped his hat to Mary. I hope the accommodations at Wheeling will suit you, Miss Green. Wheeling, West Virginia. Mary stared at the flower-faced man sitting at the table across from her. There was little she could do when the gag was back in place. He looked at his subordinate. How long have we had her in custody, Matthew? Since last August, General Rosecrans. The staff officer, a major, looked over his papers. He looked at her again. I have tried to talk to her many times and have detected no change in her character. There is not even the slightest glimmer of remorse. Do you agree? Aye, sir. The Major tightened the makeshift bandage on his arm. Stopping Mary Green's diatribe had cost him a nasty sting on his arm. She turned out to be completely unusable for almost anything. We tried to let her go to work for one family, but the result was that their children learned obscene language. Putting her in charge of cooking, as you well know, was not possible. General Rosecrans leaned back in his chair and looked at her. Yes, I'm aware of that. I had to sign requisitions to replace quite a bit of glassware and plates that she managed to destroy during her rampage. The perfect devil. Too bad she's not Catholic. We could have sent her to a convent. Even if we could, I'm not sure it wouldn't be considered a stain on the Army's honor to foist it on an unsuspecting victim, sir. I'd send her to England to distract her for a while, but I suppose that would be considered an act of war. Rosecrans looked all too pleased with his assessment. He sat up straighter, suddenly becoming much more serious. But I don't believe in leaving unsolved problems to others. I'm afraid we're going to have to do something about Miss Green, since I'm not going to leave her to gnaw on General Fremont when he comes to this headquarters. The staff officer looked at her expectantly, and Mary had no choice but to remain silent. We'll set her free. The Major froze in shock. Sir? General Rosecrans smiled, and for the first time that Mary had seen him in the last few months, there was not the slightest hint of paternalism or good humor in his smile. Tell Major Darr that I have decided to let Miss Mary Jane Green go home to Braxton County, with the hope and expectation that the next time she encounters Union troops in her usual inadequate state, they will simply shoot her without regard to her gender. His gaze drilled her. Perhaps someone less chivalrous than me can put a stop to Miss Green's inappropriate behavior. Trestle Bridge, Weston, Lewis County, Virginia. Mary crouched on the railroad embankment, watching the bulk of the rebel group work to destroy the Trestle Bridge. It wasn't going as smoothly as they had expected. Destroying the Trestle Bridge was proving to be much more difficult than they had planned. Due to the incessant rain and fog hanging over the river, the trestle was too wet to burn, and its construction was typical of railroad companies. The massive timbers of the trestle looked more like stone than wood. Their attack on telegraph lines had gone much better earlier, but telegraph lines tended to be much more fragile than railroad trestles. Because of the pre-dawn gloom and heavy fog, almost nothing could be seen, but at least the fog drowned out the sounds of sledgehammers hitting the joints of the railroad bridge. Unfortunately, it also drowns out the sounds of approaching Yankee cavalry. As soon as Mary saw the vague outline moving through the fog to the north, she raised Walker's revolver and fired at the vague figure ahead. She frantically reloaded the heavy pistol and tried to fire again as the cavalrymen let their horses gallop. The trigger jammed as she pulled the trigger. Her heart raced, and she jumped and galloped down the muddy embankment to warn the others, only to find that more cavalry was coming from the south. She looked around frantically for a way out, but the cordon was completely surrounded, and there was not a single crevice through which to slip. There were probably 40 Union soldiers surrounding her small group of 8. It was obviously hopeless, so, like the rest of her group, she simply threw her revolver to the ground and raised her hands in surrender, her wide-brimmed hat and shapeless clothes hiding her sex for the time being. Union soldiers began separating the men, taking and searching them for weapons. Mary desperately searched for a way to escape. She had heard horror stories of what happened to the unfortunate women guerrillas who fell into Union hands. Searching for salvation, Mary saw a familiar face. She had never thought she would ever want to see that face again, but now it was the only hope she had. He moved past her, watching what was happening. Keeping her voice low, she whispered hoarsely, "Lieutenant." He didn't turn around. She couldn't believe he couldn't hear her. She tried again. "Lieutenant." He still didn't turn around. As a final act of desperation, she called him by the name the others always used, Jeremiah. Finally, he turned, and she saw the twin stripes of the captain's rank on his uniform. He stared into the darkness, trying to make out her face, clearly not understanding why anyone would want to use his name. He hesitated and slowly reached out his gloved hand, as if not only doubting, but fearing the consequences. But before he could do so, she lifted the brim of her hat with both hands. He covered his eyes slightly and offered a prayer of remorse for all he had done to deserve this. Ms. Green, I'm not even going to ask why you're here and what you think you're doing. As I recall, it's been pretty pointless in the past. As hard as it was for her to ask a favor of a Yankee officer, she had to do it. Please don't let them search me. I don't have any underpinnings. Another policeman approached. She recognized Sergeant McKay just as he recognized her. He turned to the captain. I'd prefer to just finish her off rather than try to search her, sir. She tensed, not knowing how much humor and how much seriousness was in his words. The sergeant smiled at Captain Lodge. It's like you have your own personal plague, sir. I think the Egyptians might have gotten off lightly. Mary decided she'd better say something before the humor got out of hand. I will cooperate as long as the search is not conducted in an unseemly manner. With a heavy sigh, the captain hopped off his horse, and the sergeant moved onto his own to cover them. Mary noticed that the sergeant held his revolver across the saddle in her direction rather than returning it to its holster as many did. Mary stood with her arms outstretched and her legs slightly apart, turning her face away as the captain searched her. Her heart clenched when she realized he was bleeding from his leg. Since there were no other shots fired, he must have been hit. Are you hurt? He paused and looked at her incredulously. That's what happens when you shoot a man. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize that ridiculous hat? Fortunately, it turned out that rage and smugness are a poor substitute for good pistol shooting, and I got off with a scratch rather than anything serious. His search had been more thorough than she would have liked, but he was obviously driven by anger and frustration rather than idle interest. In any case, she thought, she had far fewer secrets from him than from any other man. Soon all the former partisans were searched, except for her. Captain Lodge looked around at the small, pathetic group. My instructions are to hang incendiary devices from the bridges they are trying to burn. Fortunately for you, I see no signs of fire. Though I suspect that says more about your abilities than your will. Nevertheless, this is a happy occasion for you. So instead of hanging you, we're going to send you to Provost Station, where you'll be properly sorted. With those words, he looked directly at Mary. Though I suppose there are some among you who can't be sorted properly at all. Mary was not particularly surprised that although she was allowed to remain dressed, she was forced to march with the others, all the way to the station. The rain and muddy road had made them look very bad by the time they reached Provost Station. Captain Lodge, evidently annoyed, left them standing in the rain under the stares of the soldiers, and himself went into the house to consult the provost. A few minutes later, Major Dar came out of the building to inspect the prisoners. As he passed Mary, he didn't even try to hide his amusement, only smirked, shaking his head. He looked back at Captain Lodge. Captain, it looks like our Hellion has returned to us. That's just as well. Things were awfully quiet without her, and we started picking up too many unbroken dishes in the kitchen. Wheeling, Virginia. Mary Jane Green shuddered weakly in her bed, despite the pile of blankets, one hand faintly picking at the mattress, muttering low, frightened sounds. Though she was awake, her eyes could hardly see, for the fever was taking its toll. Irish Mary looked down at her, concern written all over her face. She won't last a week if she doesn't start fighting back. Bruna nodded, frowning slightly. She had seen it before, all too often in the last few weeks. Typhoid fever swept through the neighborhood, killing so many young men. She won't take the cure. What is she talking about? Who is Scratch? Old Scratch is the devil. She says she has to marry the devil. That he's calling her, and she says she won't go. She crossed herself slowly and deliberately slowly. Bruna shuddered and muttered under her breath to Vaterunzer before answering. There's a full moon tomorrow. That's for weddings. And it's Tuesday. Weddings on Tuesdays are bad luck. Irish Mary gloomed. She's certainly a girl of character, but she doesn't deserve it. Dying of fever is bad enough, of course, but she has done nothing for Scamp himself to take her as his wife. Bruna glanced at the door and pulled a bottle of whiskey from her apron pocket. Whiskey protects against fever, so they said. It wasn't worth the risk. She sipped from the bottle and handed it to Mary, the Irish woman. It's very sad. An orphan whose brothers went off to get a soldier, Sad it is. Irish Mary took a sip of whiskey herself. It sure is. Jeremiah jumped up and woke up at his desk. He fell asleep again, reading the troop disposition. There was another knock on the door, forcing him to his feet. He pulled his suspenders over his shoulders tiredly and opened the door. A huge hand grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and dragged him into the hallway. He frantically fumbled for his revolver and only flinched when he realized it was still on his belt and in the holster slung over the bedpost where he had left it. Come on, boy, you're saving her. The very drunken Irish woman dragged him down the hallway with no more difficulty than a babysitter with a 2-year-old. Who? What are you talking about? My namesake, she is. And that's enough, isn't it? She still didn't understand, but something in her tone told Jeremiah that she was quite willing to resort to something serious to do what she wanted. In a few minutes, she opened the door to Miss Green's room, formerly a cell but now a hospital ward. She drew him up to the bed, where Miss Green lay in a ghastly pallor, twitching and muttering fearfully. Irish Mary reached down, grabbed Mary Jane Green's hand and put it in hers. We're here now, dearie, and the boy will save you. Jeremiah looked at her in disbelief. If you need a doctor... Doctor? You don't get it, kid. He's married. Jeremiah shook his head in confusion. A moment later, an equally intoxicated Bruna, baton in hand, pushed a thin man in a grey Confederate uniform through the door. I found one. Irish Mary looked at the man doubtfully. Are you a man of God? With a wary glance at Bruna and her baton blocking the door, he replied politely, I'm a chaplain with the Army of Eastern Kentucky. There's a truce here. What church, Mr. Chaplain of the Army of Eastern Kentucky? Mary's narrowed Irish eyes read a clear warning. The chaplain wondered for a moment if he should argue, but chose the safer route. Episcopalian? It's not Catholic, but it'll do. Irish Mary pointed her index finger at the chaplain. Then let's get started. We have to get it done before midnight. To what? Jeremiah and the chaplain asked at the same time. Irish Mary shook her head sadly and looked at Bruna. So they're both simple then? Bruna squinted and looked at them, a little discouraged. It must be. It's all about the breadcrumbs. It makes men even more simple than they are by nature. Irish Mary looked back at the two men. You're saving the girl. Jeremiah raised his hands in confusion. I'm not a doctor. You're a little fat kid. Handsome, but fat. You're here to save a girl's immortal soul, not her body. The chaplain started to back away from the door, but came to his senses in time when Bruna raised her baton and narrowed her eyes at him. How do I do that? She can't get married if she's already married, Bruna announced slowly and loudly from her seat, looking as if the matter was settled conclusively. Irish Mary smiled broadly. The devil's trying to take her as a bride, but he can't do that if she's already married, you know. Several more minutes passed before Jeremiah and the chaplain fully realized the ingenious plan to save Miss Mary Jane Green's soul from eternal damnation. Jeremiah wanted to object, but Mary Jane clutched at his arm as if he really was her only thread to salvation, and the pleading, the terror in her almost unintelligible words, was enough to silence him. The Confederate chaplain was more practical and fairly easygoing. He realized that the only guarantee of a safe rescue depended on convincing two very drunk, self-appointed, and rather large and stout guardian angels that he had done his best. In his opinion, it was easy enough to perform this ceremony. It didn't matter, he decided, since the girl was unlikely to survive the night anyway. He, too, had seen a lot of trouble from fever. The Irish woman managed to get mostly coherent answers out of the delirious girl, and she in turn seemed to find solace in the mating ritual, falling into a serene sleep as soon as Jeremiah kissed her forehead. Irish Mary and Bruna walked out together, quite pleased with themselves. The chaplain followed gingerly, though he was quite reassured by the bottle of whiskey and the large bag of coffee beans that Bruna had brought as payment. Jeremiah pulled a chair over to Mary Jane's bed and sat holding her hand, waiting for her to leave like so many others had lately. Captain. Jeremiah blinked, fully awake, and turned to look at the woman whose hand he held. The hand he had held every night for 6 days, reading passages from his Bible to her. The tone was so soft and calm, he barely recognized the voice. "Miss Green?" She looked at him for a long time. "Am I still here? Miss Green, I had a dream. It seemed real." She squinted slowly, looking up at the ceiling. "We got married. Married." He paused and thought for a second, then laughed. "I don't really know." Mary blinked several times. "You don't know?" He cast a puzzled look at her. "I really don't know. I'll have to ask the minister." "I remember," she interrupted, shuddering in disgust and clutching his hand like an iron hoop. "It, or him, waiting for me, and you reached for me and pulled me away." She blushed, but not with fever. Jeremiah explained to Irish Maria and Bruna their plan to trick the devil. "But I don't know if that chaplain got us wedded or just went along with it to keep himself safe and sound. I'm not Episcopalian, and I was more concerned about your condition than what he was saying. Can we be married or not?" Mary studied him for a moment. "How do we know that?" Jeremiah sighed. "We'll have to find this man and ask him if we're really married in God's eyes." Mary nodded slowly. "I guess we need to know. Why didn't you ask him?" At the time it seemed unnecessary. And I think Irish Maria and Bruna might well have beaten us to a pulp for even discussing it. Imagining this, Mary smiled with the corner of her mouth. Then the smile disappeared. "Why, Jeremiah refused to make eye contact for a long time. I didn't think it would be a big deal because we didn't think you'd survive the night." Oh, she squirmed a little in her bedding, her emaciated form almost disappearing. "But you're not dead, Mary." "No, I didn't, and we may or may not get married." She looked far less upset than he would have guessed. Perhaps the illness had dulled her emotions for a while. "I hope you weren't engaged." The thoughtful and serious tone caught Mary off guard. She looked up at him, shaking her head tiredly. "Most of the men have gone to soldier, and those who remain are simple, old, or already married." She let out a sigh that could have been a laugh if she'd had the strength. "Or they're Yankee mercenaries from the Black Republic." Jeremiah smiled bitterly. "Isn't that the same as simplicity?" She smiled weakly in response. "I wasn't going to say that out loud. I can't be rude to the man who may have saved me from the devil." He looked at the hand he still held and the skinny arm attached to it. "Do you think you can eat?" "I guess I can give it a try." Jeremiah released her hand almost reluctantly. "I'll go get Bruna." After a while of taking the clear broth, Maria was able to almost sit up on her own, which Bruna seemed pleased with. The Irish woman entered the room just as Mary was getting comfortable. "There you are, lass. We were beginning to think you wouldn't be with us anymore. Kitchen physics will do you more good than anything else. I don't think I'd be here without you and Bruna. And your Jeremiah. He sat with you every night and read God's word to you to scare away the devil himself." Even as she suspected it, Mary felt an uncharacteristic blush engulf her. "Really? Yes, that's him. Sat in that chair and slept in it. Every night, like a real husband should. Every night. And then went out every day on drills and patrols with his men, just like he does now." Mary avoided looking her in the eye, embarrassed by her thoughts. A Yankee, a damn Yankee, and she was probably married to him. That raised a question. "What was the name of the priest who married us?" "Your man already asked about it." "I don't know." Bruna went deeper into her cups and didn't ask his name. "I've had a couple cups myself, medicinal since there's a fever here." "Never mind, I'm sure he was a real minister." He was too Pecksniffian to be anything else. Mary held back her disappointment, ignoring the fact that the missing priest was the only one who could answer the looming question of whether Jeremiah was really Mary's man. Irish Mary didn't even notice it, continuing to talk nonchalantly. "As bad as the fever is, you'll be recovering for a couple months. You'll need rest for a while. You can't see yourself, but right now, all that's left of you are shadows and eyes. Almost nothing." As evening fell, the room darkened, the night held back only by the lamp Bruna had lit before she left. Despite her exhaustion, Mary lay awake in bed, unable even to close her eyes, let alone sleep. A creeping uneasiness settled in her thoughts, growing stronger and stronger until she was afraid to even blink. She felt pinned down and trapped by the shadows. she gasped as the door to her room opened silently, trying to gather the strength to scream, "Miss Green, may I come in?" The surprising relief in Jeremiah's voice displaced the fear and darkness all at once. Before she could answer, she caught the cry in her throat. "Yes, please, please come in." He stepped cautiously around the door. He paused, clearly confused. "I just wanted to stop by and see you. I was." He paused, not knowing what to say. "They said I'd be better in a month or two." Jeremiah nodded. "Do you need anything from me? Or I can go get Bruna if you'd like." The thought of the dark room gave Mary chills. The thought of being alone at night terrified her. "Did you really read the Bible to me every night?" He stepped a little closer. "That seems to have calmed you down a bit. Then perhaps it helped my healing." She looked at the chair next to the bed. He frowned slightly, then pulled a Bible out of his jacket pocket. Then he sat down and began to read to her. "Wheeling, Virginia, still no news." Bruna carefully placed the tray of leftover roast on the table and began slicing the meat. Irish Mary shook her head in disgust. "Not a word. The lad and lass must accept that their marriage is true. Here is the end of the first chapter, and now I will analyze what was in this part at all." As we delve into the heart of the story, we are confronted with the complex threads of human feelings, intertwined with the brutal tapestry of war. Set during the tumultuous times of the American Civil War, this story follows the unexpected and intricately woven paths of Elizabeth, an upper-class Southerner, and Mary, a young woman whose actions and circumstances sandwiched her between enemy lines and personal conflict. Our narrative begins with the meeting of these two contrasting characters, reinforced by the mysterious understanding hinted at in Genevieve's letter. It is young Mary, whose inner turmoil draws us deeper into the story, who seeks to find the Yankee soldier she once wounded in the line of duty, but cannot expunge from her memory. The combination of brutality and inescapable attraction sets the stage for an exploration of the often irrational nature of human emotion. Elizabeth's poised and meticulous demeanor deteriorates when she learns of Mary's violent encounters with Captain Jeremiah Lodge, actions motivated by loyalty to country and disgust for his abolitionist cause. Within this animosity, however, lies a special affection for the very man she has tried to kill 3 times. It is this paradox that illustrates the fickle behavior of the human heart, capable of both destruction and inexplicable attraction to those it perceives as adversaries. The psychology of Mary's attachment to Captain Lodge is layered and confusing. What is it? Guilt, a need for redemption, or perhaps the forbidden magic of love of the enemy? As Elizabeth witnesses this story, which promises to be as fascinating as it is confusing for her, we too are drawn into it as we analyze our own views on love, hate, loyalty, and redemption. It is important to note, however, that Mary's desire is not only generated by her own desire. Societal perceptions of a woman's behavior at the time are also at play. The young woman's incendiary actions against the Union soldiers not only contradict her social role, but also bring her to the brink of deadly consequences. Yet she remains undeterred, driven by a zeal that matches the romance of war and sacrifice of the era. As Elizabeth ponders how to help Mary in her dangerous venture that may lead her to a new encounter with Captain Lodge, we are caught between the fascination of the unfolding drama and the foreboding of its potential pitfalls. The ensuing escapade promises a rich exploration of the tangled human psyche during one of history's most volatile periods. For those who have been gripped by this story thus far and can't wait to uncover the full depths of these characters' dynamics, an unabridged version awaits you on our Patreon page. As we reflect on the beginning of this complex and emotionally intense journey, we prepare for its continuation, moving through shadows of doubt and glimmers of understanding. Stay tuned as we begin the second part of this story.